All right, here are my top 5 developmental psychology books. Now, I'm not going to list any textbooks. Textbooks are written by usually scholars in the field of or of any field who want to give a summary of everything that's been done and kind of where the field is at right now. And so the authors and books that I'm going to introduce were written by groundbreaking developmental psychologists who are saying, we've gotten something wrong. Here's what the lifespan looks like, or here's what living is like at this stage, or that stage, and so on. Some of the developmental problems that we run into. So the first one is Erikson. So this is an American psychologist. He was also a practicing analyst, a very famous analyst also. He had like famous artists and actors and other celebrities that commonly came through and sat down on his couch. But he also wrote a couple of groundbreaking books and studies in developmental psychology. So he proposed his psychosocial stages of development, but they're not stages that we pass through, like first 1, then 2, then 3, to never return to 1 or 2 again. He even drew a diagram in his book, Identity and the Life Cycle. I don't know if I actually said that, but that's the book I'm talking about. He drew a diagram to demonstrate that if we're in stage 3, for example, we're also still kind of lingering in stages 1 and 2, and we're getting a feel for stages 4 and 5, even though we don't know it yet. So while he talks about stages, and it's easy to talk about development that way, he wasn't really limited. He didn't limit development to them. Unfortunately, Erickson's writing was kind of mired in the language and vocabulary of psychoanalysis. So again, he was a practicing analyst. Of course, he used that language. Psychoanalysis hasn't really been a fixture in psychology since the 80s, at least in the US. In other countries and continents, it's still really popular. So when we read about like sexual or oral fixations, we might wonder what's so inherently sexual about being a toddler. And so it confused me when I first started reading him. And it confuses my students, and so that's one of the downsides of Erikson. But again, his work has been so accepted that it's like a textbook, unfortunately. But again, that's book number 1. Number 2 is Seasons of a Man's Life by Dan Levinson and a team of psychologists that he worked with. He did a longitudinal study, so it took decades to like collect all of this data to get a sense of what it was like to grow up as an adult in the United States, in the middle class, some lower, middle to upper, in the late 80s, or in the 80s, I guess, probably late 70s and 80s. And actually found that there were common themes and told us a lot of what we know about adult development right now. It needs to be redone. It's not the 80s anymore. It's the 2020s. So I think we would see something a lot different now, especially in the 20s and 30s, with financial problems, especially in with millennials. It could be done again. But it's a big book, but for that volume, the case studies in there are so rich, they're so descriptive, they're so informative and helpful. I definitely put that in my top 5. Number 3 is The Disappearance of Childhood by Neil Postman. Neil Postman was a media scholar at New York University. He died in the last decade, I believe, but he wrote a lot of trade press books, so popular nonfiction books, and one of them was a criticism of actually a lot of them were criticisms of entertainment. And so in The Disappearance of Childhood, Postman talks about how the very stage of childhood is social. In the medieval era, for example, there was no childhood. There was no differentiation between a child and an adult. Children were just small adults. They dressed the same, acted the same, did the same kind of labor if they could, and so on. And very little separated children from adults. Today, of course, we've got like childhood, late childhood, adolescence, early adulthood or emerging adulthood, early adulthood, and so like we've stretched that all out over 35 years. But his talk about disappearance of childhood goes back to literacy and how the important difference between a child and a teen, or a child and an adult, was the ability to read everything in the canon of their language. And so a 5-year-old can read some, but not nearly as much as a 15-year-old or an 18-year-old. But now Postman observes, and this was even like almost 15 years ago, literacy is starting to get lost. People like don't need to read anymore to vote. They can watch YouTube videos. You can watch videos like this about what books to read. Unfortunately, I'm not giving you YouTube links about these books. I'm just telling you to go read them. And so because of that, if there's no literacy anymore, there can be no childhood. And so it's a good criticism or look at how contemporary culture, or culture throughout history, shapes what it means to be a child, an adult, and so on. All right, number 4, I have Dibs in Search of Self. This is written by a therapist, a humanistic therapist by the name of Virginia Axline, I believe. And it is a case study of a boy that she worked with. The boy seemed autistic. He seemed catatonic at times. He had oppositional defiance disorder. He had a cognitive impairment. You could throw pretty much any child developmental disorder at this kid and would have stuck. But the therapist said he was one of the most emotionally neglected boys they had ever seen. It wasn't all these other neurodevelopmental disorders at all. It was his treatment. And ultimately, his parents were great parents. They did everything right. They just had no emotional relationship with their kid. So what she does is accepts him in play therapy, and she just accepts what he does and encourages him and supports him, and he gets out of his shell. It's a beautiful story, and it's about accepting yourself. It's about accepting others. It's about growing. Fantastic read. She was a student of Carl Rogers, by the way. All right, number 5, Erich Fromm's Art of Loving. I love this because relationships are an important part of human development. Pretty much from puberty on, it's an important part. But most of relationship discussions, even marriage and family therapy and counseling, tend to revolve around something that Fromm would criticize, and that something is that relationships are a transaction, and you need to be willing to put into it and get out of it certain values. And so you're not putting enough into it. You could put more. And it's this transactional view of a relationship, like it's a business deal or something like that. And Erich Fromm criticizes that. He says, no, it's not that. It's a commitment. It's a process. You commit yourself to it. And then it isn't about putting enough in. It's about putting everything in. You put all of it in. Love is not something that you hope to get a return on. The very process is letting go of the idea of the return and giving everything. And when you do that, you realize that's what wealth is, being able to give and give and give and not see your bottom line change. When you can do that, you realize you had the focus wrong all along. And it's one of the most mind-bending concepts. And it's so absent from the literature for the most part, certainly from the media. And so I like it for that reason. And the number 6, I was only going to do 5, and I don't really even have a specific number 6, but because finances are such an important part of long-term health and well-being and personal growth and development, any book that encourages you to take seriously your finances would be a great number 6 on the best developmental psychology books. Pick the one you most admire, you most esteem, provided it helps teach you about saving and avoiding debt. And so, like, we live in an upside-down economy. Most people owe more than they own. So if you can get a handle on your finances, I think developmentally that's one of the best things that you can do. So I don't have a specific book in mind because I don't study enough of it. I'm not an expert in economics, but I do have a handful of books that I appreciate and scholars that I listen to, because I realize that's an important part of human development too.